The multiverse gives Rick and Morty an almost unlimited number of possibilities. There are dimensions where humans became incredibly advanced, realities where completely different civilizations exist, and timelines where Rick and Morty themselves made decisions that changed everything. On the surface, that sounds like the ultimate freedom. If one reality goes badly, simply jump to another. But there is a darker side to that idea. Rick has spent years traveling between dimensions, and one of the biggest consequences is that he has become disconnected from the idea that any single life is truly special. To Rick, reality is almost disposable. If something goes wrong, there is always another universe. That philosophy is one of the reasons Rick appears so emotionally detached. Think about what happens when Rick and Morty destroy their own reality and move into another one. Instead of repairing the damage, they simply find a dimension where alternate versions of themselves have already died, take their place, and continue living. From a practical perspective, it works. Emotionally, however, it is disturbing. Morty has to live with the knowledge that he is no longer technically living in the same reality where he was born. His family looks familiar. His house looks familiar. His life appears familiar. But everything is slightly different. And that raises one of the biggest questions in the entire series. If another version of your life is almost identical to yours, does it matter which one you live? Rick would probably say it doesn't, but Morty slowly learns that it does. The idea becomes even more interesting when we look at the different versions of Rick throughout the multiverse. Every Rick is essentially a variation of the same person, but their choices can create radically different outcomes. Some Ricks become powerful. Some become villains. Some dedicate themselves to science. Others become completely broken. The important part is that there is no perfect Rick. Even with infinite realities, Rick cannot escape himself. That is the real meaning behind the idea that the grass is greener in other dimensions. At first, the multiverse looks like an endless collection of opportunities. If one universe is terrible, another must be better. If one relationship fails, another version of that relationship might work. If one decision leads to disaster, another version of you probably made the correct decision. But there's a problem. You are still you. Changing dimensions doesn't automatically change your personality, your regrets, or the emotional baggage you carry. Rick understands this better than almost anyone. His scientific ability gives him access to countless realities, but it does not give him emotional peace. He can escape governments, enemies, monsters, and even entire universes, yet he repeatedly finds himself facing the same internal problems. That is why Rick's relationship with Morty is so important. Morty represents the part of Rick that still cares about individual experiences. Morty may complain about his family, school, relationships, and the dangerous adventures Rick drags him into, but he still becomes attached to people and places. He doesn't have Rick's ability to treat existence like an interchangeable collection of possibilities. For Morty, this universe matters because it is his universe, and that difference creates tension between them. Rick sees infinite possibilities. Morty sees individual lives. The show constantly plays with this contrast. Imagine discovering a dimension where your family is happier. Your parents never divorced. Your career became successful. You avoided embarrassing mistakes. You met the perfect partner. Everything worked out. Would you leave your current life behind? It sounds tempting. But what happens to the people you leave behind? And more importantly, what happens to you when you realize that the better life still comes with problems? That's the trap. There is no dimension where everything is perfect. Every reality has its own disasters. One universe might give you wealth, but take away your family. Another might give you love, but destroy your freedom. Another might make you incredibly successful, while creating a completely different set of problems. The grass may look greener because you're standing far away from it. Rick's genius is that he understands how meaningless perfection becomes when there are infinite possibilities. If everything can happen somewhere, then nothing feels truly unique. This is one of the philosophical ideas hiding underneath the show's absurd comedy. Infinity sounds exciting, but it can also be terrifying. When there are infinite versions of every person, every decision, and every possible outcome, what makes your existence meaningful? Rick and Morty never gives us a simple answer. Instead, it shows us characters trying to live with that uncertainty. Rick responds by becoming cynical. Morty responds by becoming emotionally attached. Other characters respond in completely different ways. Beth, for example, struggles with questions about whether she is living the life she actually wants. Her relationship with her alternate self turns a concept into something deeply personal. Looking at another version of yourself can force you to confront the choices you made. And that's something most people understand, even without a portal gun. We all imagine alternate lives. What if I had chosen a different career? What if I had moved somewhere else? What if I had stayed with that person? What if I had taken that opportunity? Those questions create our own imaginary multiverse. But unlike Rick, we cannot open a portal and visit those realities. We can only imagine them. And perhaps that's the point. Rick's ability to travel between universes doesn't necessarily make him happier than ordinary people. In fact, it may make his existence even more complicated because he can physically see the lives he could have lived. He can meet alternate versions of himself. He can see alternate versions of Morty. He can witness different outcomes of decisions. And yet, none of it gives him the one thing he truly wants, a way to undo the pain that shaped him. That's why the multiverse isn't really about escaping consequences. It's about showing that consequences are unavoidable. You can change your location, your timeline, your identity, or even your entire universe, but you cannot completely escape yourself. And that makes the title idea incredibly powerful. The grass is greener in other dimensions. Maybe, but every dimension has its own weeds. Every perfect reality has something broken beneath the surface. Every alternate life comes with sacrifices, and every version of you has problems the other versions cannot see. For Rick, the multiverse is a playground. For Morty, it is a nightmare disguised as an adventure. For the audience, it becomes a reminder that life doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. The most important universe isn't necessarily the one where everything goes right. It may simply be the one where the people you care about are still beside you. That's something Rick struggles to accept, because if there is always another universe, it becomes easy to believe that nothing matters. But Rick and Morty repeatedly challenges that belief. People die, relationships break, families change, choices have consequences. And even in an infinite multiverse, individual moments can still matter. Maybe the real lesson is that the grass isn't greener in another dimension. Maybe it only looks greener because you haven't lived there long enough to see the problems. And perhaps that's why Rick keeps moving. Because as long as another dimension exists, he never has to admit that the problem might not be the universe. It might be him. And that is what makes the multiverse of Rick and Morty so fascinating. It isn't simply a collection of infinite worlds. It's a reflection of the human desire to escape regret. Every portal represents another possibility. Every alternate reality represents another choice. And every version of Rick and Morty reminds us that no matter how many realities exist, there is still one unavoidable question. What are you going to do with the reality you're already in? Because sometimes the grass isn't greener somewhere else. Sometimes you just have to learn how to live with the grass beneath your own feet. The obvious answer is that every version is real. But emotionally, the answer isn't so simple. Rick often treats alternate versions of people as replaceable. This is one of the clearest examples of how his intelligence has affected his humanity. Because he understands the scale of the multiverse, he knows that losing one person does not necessarily mean losing every version of that person. If one Morty dies, another Morty exists somewhere. If one Beth dies, countless other Beths continue living. If one universe is destroyed, an unimaginable number of others remain. From a mathematical perspective, this makes individual loss seem insignificant, but emotionally it shouldn't. And that conflict is one of the show's greatest strengths. The multiverse allows the writers to explore consequences in ways that ordinary science fiction stories can't. Normally, if a character makes a terrible decision, the audience knows there is no going back. But Rick can sometimes escape consequences by moving to another reality. That creates the illusion that nothing matters. But the emotional consequences follow him. Morty still remembers. Rick still remembers. The trauma doesn't disappear just because the scenery changes. This is particularly important for Morty because his adventures with Rick gradually force him to become more mature. At the beginning, Morty is terrified of almost everything. He doesn't understand Rick's technology, doesn't understand a multiverse, and frequently wants to return home. But the more realities he visits, the more he begins to understand the rules. And understanding those rules changes him. Morty learns that there are infinite versions of himself. Some are smarter, some are stronger, some are more confident, some have better relationships, some have completely destroyed their lives. This creates an uncomfortable comparison. If another version of you is doing better, why aren't you? That's where the title idea becomes almost painfully relatable. The grass is always greener in another dimension because you are comparing your entire life to an imaginary version of someone else's. We do this constantly in real life. Social media can function like a miniature multiverse. You see someone else's success, but don't see their struggles. You see someone's relationship, but don't see their arguments. You see someone's money, but don't see their debt. You see their best moments while comparing them to your worst. Rick and Morty takes that familiar human behavior and makes it literal. Instead of scrolling through someone's perfect life, the characters can actually travel there. And what they discover is usually that perfection doesn't exist. One of the most interesting consequences of infinite realities is that it destroys the concept of the one. In a normal world, people often believe there is one perfect partner, one perfect career, or one perfect path. But if infinite realities exist, there are potentially infinite versions of every relationship. There could be another universe where you stayed with someone you broke up with. There could be another universe where you never met them. There could be another universe where you met them earlier. There could even be a universe where you became completely different people. So which relationship is the real one? Rick's answer would probably be that none of them are inherently more important. But Morty's emotional instincts suggest otherwise. The relationship you actually experience matters because you experienced it. That's an important distinction. Meaning doesn't necessarily come from uniqueness. Something doesn't have to happen only once in the entire multiverse to matter. A memory can be meaningful even if millions of versions of the same event happen elsewhere. A friendship can matter even if another version of you has a different best friend. A family can matter even if another version of your family is happier. This is where the series becomes surprisingly philosophical. Infinity doesn't eliminate meaning. It challenges us to create meaning ourselves. Rick struggles with this because his scientific worldview makes everything seem replaceable. He can manufacture inventions. He can create portals. He can manipulate dimensions. He can solve problems that ordinary humans couldn't even understand. But there are things even Rick cannot manufacture. He cannot manufacture genuine emotional connection. He cannot force himself to stop grieving. He cannot simply invent a perfect version of his life and erase every painful memory. And perhaps that is why he continues searching. Rick's endless movement may actually be a form of avoidance. If he keeps exploring new dimensions, he doesn't have to stay in one place long enough to confront what he's feeling. Every new universe becomes another distraction, another adventure, another crisis, another excuse. But eventually, the same problems return. This is one of the central ironies of Rick's character. He can travel anywhere in existence, yet he repeatedly finds himself trapped inside his own mind. The multiverse gives him infinite physical freedom, but very little emotional freedom. Morty, meanwhile, begins to discover that escaping isn't always the answer. Sometimes you have to stay. Sometimes you have to deal with the consequences. Sometimes you have to accept that your reality is imperfect. And that is an incredibly important lesson hidden inside all the chaos. Because the multiverse can make dissatisfaction almost infinite. Imagine knowing that there is definitely a reality where you made the perfect decision. That knowledge could destroy your ability to appreciate your current life. Every mistake would become more painful. Every failure would make you wonder what another version of you is doing. Every bad day could become evidence that you chose the wrong timeline. But the truth is that there is no way to prove another reality is actually better. You only see the result. You don't see the hidden cost. Maybe that alternate Rick has more money, but no family. Maybe that alternate Morty is more confident, but completely alone. Maybe that successful version of Beth sacrificed something important to become successful. Maybe the version of Jerry who seems happier is dealing with a problem nobody knows about. The The multiverse reminds us that every choice creates both gains and losses. You cannot choose one path without giving up another. That is true whether there are infinite universes or only one. And perhaps that is why the series uses absurdity so effectively. The ridiculous adventures allow the audience to laugh at concepts that would otherwise be terrifying. Alien civilizations, interdimensional travel, alternate realities, cosmic beings, apocalyptic scenarios. Underneath all of it are very human fears. Fear of making the wrong decision. Fear of wasting your life. Fear that someone else is living the life you wanted. Fear that you could have been better. Fear that you are trapped. Rick represents an extreme version of that fear. He has enough intelligence to know that almost every possibility exists somewhere. But instead of making him satisfied, that knowledge makes him cynical. Because when everything is possible, nothing feels final. And when nothing feels final, commitment becomes difficult. Why settle for one life when infinite lives exist? Why love one person when infinite versions exist? Why remain in one universe when you can leave whenever you want? But eventually, the answer becomes clear. Because life isn't valuable simply because it is rare. Life is valuable because it is experienced. Your particular relationships, memories, failures, victories, and choices form a story that cannot be replaced simply because another version exists. Another universe may have a different version of you, but that version doesn't have your exact memories. They didn't experience your childhood. They didn't make your mistakes. They didn't meet the exact people you met. They didn't live your exact story. And that's what gives your reality significance. The grass may look greener in another dimension, but you don't know what it took to grow that grass. Maybe it was watered with sacrifices. Maybe the soil is toxic. Maybe underneath the beautiful surface is another disaster waiting to happen. Rick's greatest mistake isn't that he travels between dimensions. It's that he sometimes forgets that changing realities doesn't automatically solve emotional problems. You can run from one universe to another, but if you carry the same mindset, you may eventually recreate the same problems. And that is perhaps the most powerful message behind the multiverse. Sometimes the universe isn't the problem. Sometimes the problem is the way you look at it. Rick can open a portal to almost anywhere, but the hardest journey for him isn't across space or dimensions. It's learning how to accept the reality directly in front of him, because somewhere out there may be a better version of your life. There may be a smarter version of you, a richer version, a happier version, a version that made every decision correctly. But that doesn't make your life worthless. It simply means that infinite possibilities exist. And if Rick and Morty teaches us anything, it's that chasing every possible reality can make you forget to actually live in one. The grass might be greener somewhere else. But eventually, you have to stop looking through the portal. You have to step back into your own world and decide whether you're going to keep searching for a perfect reality or make the imperfect one you're standing and worth living.